the master widow who summoned her slave to her bedroom every midnight for 3 years. Thomas's price. Every night at exactly 12, when the plantation clocks fell silent and the moon climbed above the cypress trees, a single candle was lit in the master's bedroom. For 3 long years, that light meant one thing: a summons. The servants whispered about it. The overseer pretended not to notice. And Thomas, bound by chains he could not see, rose from his pallet each midnight, knowing the price of refusal was far greater than the cost of obedience. But what no one understood was this: the widow was not calling him for power alone. She was hiding a secret that could destroy them both. This story unfolds in the American South during the early 1800s, on a cotton plantation weighed down by grief, silence, and unspoken rules. At its center stands Widow Eleanor Price, a woman wrapped in black silk in sorrow after her husband's sudden death. Beneath her roof live dozens of enslaved souls, including Thomas, a quiet young man known for his steady hands and watchful eyes. As seasons pass and nights repeat themselves, an invisible bond forms, one shaped by fear, longing, and the dangerous crossing of lines that were never meant to be touched. If you enjoy deep, emotional historical stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and support the channel. The Price plantation stretched wide along the riverbanks, its fields breathing dust in summer and fog in winter. After Master Henry Price was laid into the ground beneath an old oak tree, the house fell into an unnatural quiet. Laughter disappeared. Music vanished. Even footsteps seemed to soften out of respect or fear. Widow Eleanor Price ruled the estate with calm precision. She wore mourning black not just on her body, but in her eyes. Though still young, she spoke little and trusted few. The overseer managed the fields, but the house remained hers alone, guarded by closed doors and long nights. Thomas belonged to the house. He was tall, reserved, and observant, chosen years earlier for his ability to listen without speaking. He carried water, polished floors, and stood silently during meals. No one knew his thoughts, but everyone knew his discipline. Then the midnight summons began. A bell rang softly. Once, always once. Thomas rose without question, his heart steady but heavy, and walked the narrow hallway toward the widow's chamber. The door never fully closed behind him. What passed between them was never spoken of during the day. Yet each night bound Thomas tighter to a fate he did not choose, and each morning left the widow staring at the window as though waiting for something she could not name. The cost of those nights had only just begun to reveal itself. Days on the Price plantation followed a strict rhythm, yet beneath that order, something fragile and dangerous was taking shape. Widow Eleanor moved through the house like a shadow draped in silk, her grief carefully arranged for the world to see. By day, she was distant and commanding. By night, when the corridors emptied and the lamps dimmed, her stillness broke. Thomas noticed the change before anyone else. At midnight, the bell rang as it always did, one soft note, thin as a breath. Thomas would rise from his narrow bed, smooth his shirt, and walk the familiar path to the master's wing. He never hurried, never delayed. The hallway creaked beneath his steps as if the house itself remembered what had been lost. Inside the bedroom, Eleanor never spoke at first. She sat by the window or at the edge of the bed, her back straight, hands folded. Sometimes she asked Thomas to pour water, sometimes to read aloud from her husband's old books, histories, letters, ledgers he never finished. His voice, steady and low, seemed to calm something restless inside her. At first, that was all. Yet silence has a way of growing heavy. One night, as rain pressed against the windows, Eleanor broke it. "Do you ever dream of another life?" she asked without turning. Thomas hesitated. He had learned that hesitation could be dangerous, but honesty carried its own risk. "I dream of quiet," he answered carefully. She nodded, as though that answer belonged to her too. From that night forward, the questions continued. About his childhood, about the river beyond the fields, about what he remembered of his mother's voice. Eleanor never asked forgiveness, never offered kindness openly, but she listened with an intensity that unsettled Thomas more than anger ever had. By daylight, the plantation stirred with unease. The overseer, Mr. Caldwell noticed the way Thomas was spared from punishment, how his hours shifted strangely, how his eyes carried a weight they had not before. The house servants whispered among themselves, exchanging glances when Thomas passed. "Careful," an older woman warned him one afternoon in the kitchen. "Midnight paths don't lead anywhere safe." Thomas did not answer. He already knew. Meanwhile, Eleanor's reputation began to change. Visitors remarked on her pale appearance, her refusal to remarry, her tendency to dismiss suitors with polite distance. They called her strong, proud, faithful to her late husband's memory. None of them saw her standing awake at night, candle shaking in her hand, waiting for footsteps in the hall. As weeks turned into months, the boundaries shifted. Eleanor no longer sat across the room. She asked Thomas to stand closer. She asked him to stay longer. Sometimes she spoke of her marriage, not with anger, but with emptiness. Henry Price, she revealed, had been a man devoted to control, not comfort. The house had never truly been warm. "You are the only one who listens," she said once, her voice barely louder than the rain outside. Thomas felt the danger then, sharp and unmistakable. He understood power. He lived under it. Yet what frightened him most was not Eleanor's authority. It was her loneliness. Loneliness made people reckless. One night, Eleanor pressed a small cloth into Thomas's hand. Inside was a dark salve, thick and herbal. "For your hands," she said. "They work too hard." He stared at it. Such gestures were not allowed. "Not like this. I cannot accept." "You will," she interrupted, but her voice trembled. That was the first time Thomas realized she was afraid. Not of him, but of herself. Outside the house, tension gathered like a storm. Caldwell questioned the late-night candlelight. The master's relatives wrote letters asking about the estate. Rumors slipped into the nearby town, half-formed but dangerous enough, and Thomas began to understand the truth. These midnight meetings were no accident of grief. Eleanor was holding on to him as one holds onto a railing over deep water. If she let go, she feared she would fall. Yet every night he walked that hallway knowing one certainty above all others. What was growing between them could never be named. And when something forbidden remains unnamed for too long, it eventually demands a price. The night the truth could no longer remain hidden. The third year of Midnight's summons began with a silence heavier than all the ones before it. Winter pressed hard against the Price plantation. The river slowed, the fields lay bare, and the house seemed to shrink inward, as if listening to its own heartbeat. Thomas felt it in his chest long before the bell rang, that something was about to break. That night, the bell did not ring once. It rang twice. Thomas froze on his pallet. Twice had never happened. Twice was not routine. Twice was urgency. When he entered the widow's chamber, the candlelight revealed Eleanor standing, not seated. Her mourning dress was gone. In its place was a simple white gown, plain and unadorned, as if she had stripped herself of every title the world had given her. "Close the door," she said. Thomas did, his hands unsteady for the first time in 3 years. "I am leaving this house," Eleanor said suddenly, "or I will lose my mind within it." The words struck like thunder. Thomas said nothing, waiting. "They are coming," she continued. "My husband's brother, his lawyers. They believe something is wrong here." Her voice cracked. "They are not entirely mistaken." She turned to face him, and for the first time, Thomas saw fear without restraint. "I did not call you here to listen tonight," she said softly. "I called you because I must decide what I am willing to destroy." Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. She crossed the room slowly. Every step felt final. "For 3 years, you have carried my grief," Eleanor said. "You have stood where no one else would. You have given me silence when I asked, truth when I needed it." She stopped an arm's length away. "And now," she whispered, "they will take you from this house, or they will take me." The truth unfolded then, not as confession, but as inevitability. Caldwell had spoken. The letters had grown sharper. The widow's authority was being questioned, and Thomas's presence had become evidence, not of kindness, of impropriety, of scandal they were eager to create. "You will be sold," Eleanor said. tears finally falling. That is what they plan. Thomas closed his eyes. He had always known this story did not end quietly. I can stop it, she said urgently. I can sign the papers. I can send you away tonight. North, far from this place. Freedom. The word echoed, fragile and terrifying. But there is a cost, she continued, her voice barely sound now. If I do this, I lose everything. The house, the land, my name. Thomas looked at her then, truly looked, not as a master, not as a widow, but as a woman standing at the edge of ruin. You must not, he said. You owe me nothing. She laughed weakly. That is where you are wrong. She reached into the drawer and pulled out documents, sealed, signed, hidden for years. A manumission paper bearing Thomas's name, dated long ago, never filed. I prepared this after the first year, she confessed, and every year after, I was too afraid to use it. Thomas's knees nearly gave way. You were never meant to stay, she said. I kept you because I was afraid to be alone. The room fell silent except for the wind. At that moment, footsteps sounded in the hall. Heavy, deliberate. Caldwell's voice followed. Madam, we need to speak. Eleanor's face hardened. There it is, she said. The price. She pressed the papers into Thomas's hands. Go, she commanded. Through the back stairs. The carriage waits. Thomas hesitated. For the first time in 3 years, he chose hesitation. If I leave, he said quietly, you stand alone. Eleanor straightened, dignity returning like armor. I have been alone longer than you know, she replied. Tonight, I choose the truth. The door shook under Caldwell's knock. Thomas turned and ran. Behind him, the widow opened the door, her voice calm, steady, unbreakable. And in that moment, when footsteps fled into darkness and truth stood in candlelight, their secret ended. But the consequences had only begun. Thomas did not remember how his feet carried him through the back corridors. He remembered only the sound of his breath and the burning cold in his lungs as he descended the narrow servants' stairs. The house that had once felt endless now rushed past him like a closing trap. Outside, the night was sharp and silent. A small carriage waited near the old tool shed, its lantern dimmed. The driver, a man Eleanor trusted long before she trusted herself, did not ask questions. He only nodded once. As the carriage wheels began to turn, Thomas looked back. The Price house stood tall against the moonlight, its windows dark except for one. A door opened. Voices rose. Then the light vanished. Thomas pressed the folded papers to his chest. Freedom weighed heavier than chains ever had. Inside the house, Eleanor Price faced the reckoning she had postponed for 3 years. Caldwell entered with 2 men behind him, Henry Price's brother and a lawyer dressed in the stiff authority of written law. Their eyes scanned the room quickly, missing what mattered most. Where is he? Caldwell demanded. Eleanor did not sit. She did not flinch. Gone, she answered. The word struck them harder than any confession. Henry's brother scoffed. You think that ends this? It ends my silence, Eleanor replied. She placed her hand on the desk where the candles still burned. She spoke calmly, carefully, choosing truth over defense. She admitted the nightly meetings. She admitted the emotional dependence. She admitted the weakness she had hidden behind mourning clothes. But she did not admit wrongdoing. He was never forced, she said. Nor was he promised what I could not give. The lawyer frowned. The law was not built for honesty, only ownership. By dawn, the decision was made. Eleanor would be removed from direct control of the estate. A guardian would manage the property until her remarriage or departure. Her name would remain, but her power would not. She accepted the judgment without protest. By the time the sun rose, the Price house felt hollow. Servants moved carefully. Whispers followed Eleanor's shadow. She retreated to the back rooms, no longer master, not yet free. Days passed. Thomas traveled north through back roads and quiet towns, guided by Eleanor's careful planning. Each stop carried danger. Each mile brought unfamiliar hope. He learned to sleep lightly, to trust slowly. At night, he read the papers again and again, as if they might vanish. His name, his freedom, signed long before the world was ready to accept it. He thought often of Eleanor, not with longing, but with gravity. Some bonds were not meant to be carried forward. They existed to be survived. Back at the plantation, the absence of Thomas changed everything. The house no longer woke at midnight. The candles stayed dark. Eleanor began walking the grounds during the day, unaccompanied. She spoke to the enslaved workers, not as a ruler, but as someone finally listening. She could not undo the past, but she could alter what came next. She ordered fairer rations, reduced punishments, quiet changes, unnoticed by distant eyes, but deeply felt by those who lived there. Caldwell resigned within the month, and one evening, Eleanor stood beneath the oak where Henry was buried. She removed her black veil and placed it at the base of the tree. "I paid the price," she whispered. "Now let me live with it." Far away, Thomas crossed a river under cover of fog. As the water moved beneath him, he realized something profound. He was not running anymore. He was arriving. Spring arrived gently in the north, as if the world itself understood that Thomas needed time. The air was cooler, the soil darker, the mornings quieter than any he had known. He found work under a new name, chosen not to erase the past, but to protect the future. In this place, no one asked where he came from. They asked only what he could do. Thomas learned quickly. He worked with wood and iron, his hands still bearing the memory of cotton but now shaping something lasting. Each evening, he returned to a small rented room and sat by the window, listening to unfamiliar sounds, church bells, laughter, freedom. Freedom, he discovered, was not loud. It was steady. There were nights when he woke before midnight, his body still expecting a bell that would never ring again. On those nights, he reminded himself that the past had ended because someone chose truth over fear. He never spoke Eleanor's name aloud. Back at the Price plantation, Eleanor's world had narrowed, but it had also sharpened. With her authority reduced, she found clarity. She read. She wrote letters she never sent. She walked the fields and learned names she had once ignored. The workers noticed the change, not kindness, but consistency. A difference that did not promise miracles, yet offered dignity where it could. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It bore no seal, no return address. Inside was a single sentence written in careful ink. "I arrived." Eleanor sat with that letter for a long time. She did not cry. She did not smile. She placed it inside a book Henry had never finished reading and closed it gently. That night, she slept through midnight for the first time in years. Months passed. The estate was eventually sold. Eleanor did not contest it. She took a modest sum and left the plantation quietly, without ceremony or farewell. The house stood empty for a season before new owners arrived, unaware of the secrets held within its walls. Eleanor traveled east, settling near the coast where no one knew her history. She dressed simply now, spoke softly, and kept her past folded neatly inside herself. She never married again. Thomas's life grew slowly, like a careful song. He made friends. He saved money. He learned to read better, to speak freely, to plan beyond the next sunrise. For the first time, the future belonged to him. Years later, he stood by a river not unlike the one he had crossed before. He thought of the woman who had once held his fate in her hands, and then let it go, not out of love, but out of responsibility. And that, he understood, was the difference that mattered. Many years later, long after the Price plantation had faded into records and rumors, people still spoke of the widow who never remarried and the servant who vanished without trace. Stories traveled farther than truth, changing shape with each retelling. Some said the widow had been cruel. Others claimed she had been merciful. Few understood how narrow the space between those two things truly was. Thomas lived long enough to see the world change in ways he had once believed impossible. Laws shifted. Borders softened. Voices that had been silenced found ways to speak. He built a life not marked by spectacle, but by steadiness. He became known as a man who listened carefully and spoke only when his words mattered. In the quiet hours of old age, Thomas sometimes reflected on the question Eleanor had asked him years ago, whether he ever dreamed of another life. He had not dreamed it. He had lived it. The memory of the midnight bell remained, not as fear, but as a reminder of how easily power could be mistaken for connection, and how costly it was to untangle the two. Thomas understood that his price had never been obedience, nor silence. His price had been patience. For Eleanor, the years unfolded gently, but without illusion. She devoted herself to small, unseen acts, funding schools through intermediaries, offering quiet support where her name could do no harm. She never sought redemption publicly. She believed some reckonings were meant to remain private. On her final day, she asked for a window to be opened. The sea air filled the room. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, not midnight, but morning. She smiled faintly, not at memory, but at release. When Eleanor Price passed, there was no great announcement, just a modest notice and a life closed without applause. Yet her choices had already moved beyond her, carried forward by the freedom she had not reclaimed for herself. History rarely records the quiet exchanges, the moments where one person steps back so another may step forward. But those moments shape the world all the same. This story is not about romance dressed as rescue, nor power softened by grief. It is about boundaries learned too late and courage found just in time. It is about a man who walked into darkness every night and chose light when it was finally offered. And it is about a woman who learned that possession was never the same as presence. The bell never rang again, but its echo changed two lives forever.